Hi there. Today we are going to do chapters 9 and 10 of the Bailey School Kids. Vampires Don't Wear Polka Dots. Here we go. Chapter 9. The Boss. The students filed into the room and silently took their seats. Sitting up straight, they waited for Mrs. Jeepers to begin class. She stood stiffly and looked at every student in the room. When I was a child in Romania, we were taught to be respectful of all others, she began. It was a reward in itself when we pleased our elders. We only needed to be told once to keep the floors free from litter or to keep our appearance neat. Mrs. Jeepers paused to glance at the floor. Papers were scattered around nearly every desk. She cleared her throat once and then waited. Some students looked uncomfortably at each other, while a few others tucked in their shirts and swallowed wads of chewing gum. Then very slowly, they leaned down and scooped up trash, pencils, and erasers so that the floor was clean. Without waiting to be asked, Howie walked to the front of the room and picked up the trash can. He kept his eyes glued to the floor as he walked up and down the aisles, collecting trash. Thank you, class, particularly Howie. I'm sure I will not need to remind you again about the appearance of the room or of yourselves. Mrs. Jeepers' green eyes flashed and her brooch seemed to glow dully. Forgive me if I seem to be grouchy today, Mrs. Jeepers continued. I had the unfortunate experience of having prowlers enter my home last night. They disturbed my sleep. She peered around the room, letting her green eyes rest on Melody and Eddie for a split second. Then she blinked and smiled. However, no harm was done, and I'm willing to forget the experience. I feel sure that it will never happen again. Now please open your English books, and we will begin our lesson. Melody's hands trembled, and she peeked at Eddie. He had his attention glued to his book. No one made a sound as Mrs. Jeepers began teaching the class about nouns and verbs. The rest of the morning passed quickly. By lunchtime, the third graders had finished all their assignments and were ready for a break. In the cafeteria, they quietly began to eat their lunches. What's wrong with you guys? Ben asked from the next table. Ben was a fourth grader in Mr. Power's room. He was known for his loud voice and for the dumb jokes he told. You're all so quiet today. Shh, Mrs. Jeepers and I hear you, Howie whispered. So what? Talking is allowed in the cafeteria. Don't tell me you're actually scared of a teacher. Ben laughed and poked Eddie in the ribs. Eddie washed down the rest of his peanut butter and jelly sandwich with a swig of milk. Cut it out, Ben. What's the matter? Ben started to laugh. Don't tell me you're turning into a teacher's pet. No way, Eddie hissed. Whatever you say, sissy, Ben teased as both the classes stood up to empty their lunch trays. Eddie stuck out his foot to trip Ben. He smiled when Ben's tray went crashing to the floor. That'll teach you to call me a sissy, Eddie snapped. He hurried to line up with the rest of his class before Ben could say anything else. Once the third grade was back in their room, Eddie started thinking. Things had definitely gotten out of hand. He wasn't used to a teacher making him behave. This had to stop. He was determined to show Mrs. Jeepers who was boss. Chapter 10. I wonder what he's going to do. I think he's still a little afraid of her, don't you? So chapter 10 is called Freeze. Eddie went into action. He knocked something off every desk he walked by, scattering papers everywhere. He stuffed a wad of bubble gum in his mouth and started popping bubbles loudly. Melody looked at him in disbelief. Are you crazy? She whispered. I know exactly what I'm doing, Eddie said as he blew another big bubble. Melody shrugged. It's your funeral. Mrs. Jeepers paid no attention to Eddie. She was too busy grading papers. Eddie decided to give her something to notice. He slouched down in his chair and kicked his shoes off. Then he propped his feet up on the seat in front of him. Once he was comfortable, he started stretching his gum to see how long he could make it. When it finally broke, he twirled the slimy strand around his finger. Mrs. Jeepers still did not look up. This was getting ridiculous. Then he had an inspiration. He took 3 giant gulps of air, put his head down, and let out a deep burp. Howie laughed out loud, but stopped when Mrs. Jeepers cleared her throat. Eddie stuffed the gum back into his mouth and with precise timing managed to pop a bubble and burp at the same time. A few kids around him snickered. Eddie was feeling good now. He was ready for his grand finale. He looked around to make sure everyone was watching. Then he blew the biggest bubble he'd ever blown. Just as he was ready to suck it back into his mouth, he saw Mrs. Jeepers through the filmy pink bubble. Her eyes flashed and she gently rubbed her brooch. She held up her hand and flicked her finger in Eddie's direction. Instantly, the bubble popped. Gobs of pink, sticky gum covered Eddie's face and hair. Mrs. Jeepers smiled her odd little half smile and then went back to grading papers. A few kids stared with their mouths hanging open. Mrs. Jeepers hadn't even moved from her desk, but she had made Eddie's bubble pop. As Eddie started pulling stringy globs from his eyebrows, he heard Howie and Melody giggling. "What's so funny?" he said, pulling gum from the tip of his ear. Howie turned back to his work, but Melody couldn't stop laughing. "She really got you that time," Melody whispered between giggles. "What are you talking about? It was just a coincidence," Eddie snapped. Melody shook her head as though she didn't believe him, then turned back to her work. Eddie finished scraping gum from his nose and chin. He decided to cut the rest of the gum from his hair when he got home. He drummed his fingers on his desk while he thought about what had happened. Things certainly had not gone the way he planned. Instead of getting Mrs. Jeepers upset, he had ended up being embarrassed in front of all his friends. This called for drastic measures. Eddie was still trying to think of something to do when Mrs. Jeepers cleared her throat. "You have been working very nicely this afternoon. I have decided that we might play math relays for the rest of the day." Everybody clapped their hands. Math relays were a great way to practice their multiplication tables. Two teams quickly lined up. Mrs. Jeepers stood at the front of each line and held up a flashcard. Several kids were hopping up and down as they tried to think of answers while others were trying to count on their fingers. They had gone 2 rounds before Eddie came up with a brainstorm. This was the perfect time to cause trouble. Even though it wasn't his turn, he yelled out the wrong answer on purpose. Mrs. Jeepers flashed her eyes at him, but continued holding up the card. The next time she showed a card, Eddie burped. His teammates stopped long enough to glare at him. It was Carrie's and Liza's turn. Carrie held both her hands in front of her as if she were praying. Liza was so excited she hopped on one foot and shook her arms as if they were wet. Eddie jabbed Howie and pointed at Liza. "Look at her," he laughed. "She looks like she's trying to fly. Watch." Eddie started jumping and flapping his arms in the air. He bumped into several students and knocked down a chair. He didn't even notice Mrs. Jeepers. Mrs. Jeepers rubbed her brooch until it shone bright green. "That is quite enough," she said rather sternly. Eddie acted as though he hadn't heard a thing, but there was something about her brooch that caught his eye. He stopped jumping just to watch it. The more Mrs. Jeepers rubbed it, the more it seemed to glow. He couldn't take his eyes off it. "We may continue our game now," Mrs. Jeepers informed the class. "We will no longer be rudely interrupted." With serious expressions, the students turned back to Mrs. Jeepers. They no longer were excited about the game. As a matter of fact, it was sort of creepy because they kept having to step around Eddie. He stayed rooted in the same spot, staring at Mrs. Jeepers' green brooch for the rest of the game. Finally, the bell rang. As the class lined up, Mrs. Jeepers walked over to Eddie. She placed her left hand on her brooch, then snapped her fingers in front of his face. "Hey," he said loudly, "aren't we going to play anymore?" Whoa, it was like he was in some kind of a trance. Okay. Next section will be the end of the book, chapters 11 through 13.